Hello, everyone. Welcome to Blacktop Files. Tonight, we bring you some of the most unsettling accounts ever reported from search and rescue operations deep in the Appalachian Mountains. For those just joining us, Blacktop Files collects long-form true horror stories from across the United States. We focus on the kinds of encounters that don't make headlines, the incidents that get filed away quietly, the reports that leave more questions than answers. Tonight's episode centers on a very specific kind of terror, the things that search and rescue teams encounter in the mountains when they're looking for someone who went missing. These are stories from volunteers, rangers, paramedics, and coordinators who've spent years working these ridges and hollows. People who know the terrain better than anyone. And yet, even with all that experience, they've run into situations that don't make sense. Things that violate every rational explanation the mountains might offer. The Appalachians are old. They're worn down, covered in thick forest, cut through with thousands of miles of trails and logging roads and unmarked paths that haven't been maintained in generations. When someone goes missing out there, the search area can be massive. You're dealing with elevation changes, dense laurel thickets, steep drop-offs, cave systems, abandoned structures from old mining or logging operations. Weather can turn in an hour. A search that starts in mild conditions can end in freezing rain or fog, so thick you can't see 10 feet ahead. It's hard, dangerous work, and the people who do it are used to that. They're used to finding lost hikers, injured climbers, confused elderly folks who wandered off from a campsite. They're used to the tragedy of it, the recoveries that come too late, the searches that end without answers. But every once in a while, something happens that doesn't fit, a detail that shouldn't be there. Evidence that makes no sense. Behavior from a missing person that defies logic or physics. Discoveries that leave even the most experienced teams unsettled. Tonight, you're going to hear 8 accounts from men who've worked search and rescue in different parts of the Appalachians. They've asked that certain identifying details be left out for obvious reasons. But the core of what they experienced remains intact. If you're new to Blacktop Files, please consider subscribing so you don't miss future episodes. Turn on notifications so you know exactly when a new file drops. And if you've ever had an experience you can't explain, something that happened out on a trail, a back road, a night shift, or anywhere else, share it in the comments below. Your story might end up in a future file. Let's get into tonight's accounts. The first one comes from a volunteer coordinator who's been working searches in the southern Appalachians for over 15 years. I stopped taking coordination roles on searches in that particular district the winter I turned 43. People ask why, and I usually say something about workload or family time, which isn't entirely untrue. But the real reason is what we found during a search that November, and more specifically, what we didn't find. I'd been doing search and rescue volunteer work for about 15 years at that point, mostly in the southern Appalachian range, coordinating teams, managing communication between ground crews and base, that sort of thing. You get used to the difficult parts. You get used to the fact that not every search ends well. You accept that sometimes people make poor decisions in the backcountry, and the consequences are fatal. You learn to compartmentalize the recoveries, the ones where you're not looking for someone alive anymore, just bringing them home to their families. That's hard, but it's part of the work. What happened that November was different. The call came in on a Thursday evening, right around dusk. A hiker hadn't returned from a day hike on a moderately trafficked trail. One of those routes that's popular with locals, but not crowded. The trail ran along a ridgeline for about 8 miles, then looped back through a series of switchbacks. Pretty typical terrain for that area. Mixed hardwood forest, some rocky outcroppings, a few stream crossings in the lower elevations. The hiker was a guy in his late 20s. Experience enough, had done the trail before. He'd told his girlfriend he'd be back by 4 in the afternoon. When he wasn't back by 6 and wasn't answering his phone, she called it in. By the time we got the team mobilized and staged at the trailhead, it was nearly 9 at night. Cold, clear skies, temperature dropping fast. We sent out 3 teams, each with 4 volunteers, covering different sections of the trail. Standard grid search, starting from the last known location and working outward. The first few hours were uneventful. Teams checked in every 30 minutes, reported no signs, moved deeper into their assigned sectors. Around midnight, one of the teams radioed in that they'd found his car still parked at the trailhead lot, which we'd already confirmed, but they also found his pack. It was sitting just off the trail about 2 miles in, leaning against a tree, not hidden or damaged, just set down. That was the first thing that felt off. If you're hiking and you need to set your pack down, you do it because you're tired or you're taking a break, or maybe you're hurt. But you don't just leave it there and keep going, especially not when it's getting dark and cold. His wallet, keys, phone, all of it was still in the pack. Water bottles, snacks, a first aid kit, a headlamp, everything you'd need to get yourself out safely. We expanded the search around that area, figuring maybe he'd gotten disoriented, wandered off trail. It happens. People take a wrong turn, think they know where they are, and end up a half-mile away in dense brush before they realize their mistake. But the terrain there wasn't that confusing. The trail was well marked, and the forest on either side was open enough that you could see through it pretty far, especially with no leaves on the trees that time of year. We searched through the night, brought in a dog team at first light. The dogs picked up his scent at the pack, followed it down the trail for another 1/4 mile, then lost it. Not at a stream crossing, not at a rocky area where scent might disperse. Just lost it in the middle of the trail, like he'd stopped existing right there. That's when we started considering other possibilities. Maybe he'd met someone, gotten a ride, left voluntarily. Except his car was still there, and his girlfriend said there was no reason he'd just take off. No arguments, no issues, nothing strange in the days leading up to the hike. We kept searching, brought in more teams, covered the surrounding ridges, checked every hollow and creek bed within a 2-mile radius. Found nothing. No footprints off trail, no clothing, no signs of a struggle or a fall. It was like he'd set his pack down, walked another 1/4 mile, and vanished. On the 3rd day, we found the first marker. One of the teams was working a sector, about a mile east of where the scent trail had ended, up near a rocky outcropping that overlooked a steep drop into a ravine. They found a small pile of stones stacked in a cairn, maybe a foot high, sitting right in the middle of a flat section of granite. That's not unusual by itself. Hikers build cairns all the time, trail markers, personal memorials, that sort of thing. But this one was strange because it was fresh. The stones on top still had mud on them, and there was no lichen or weathering. Someone had built it recently. We documented it, kept moving. Then we found another one. Same design, same size, about a half-mile further along the ridge. Then another, and another. Over the course of that day, we found 11 of them, all spaced roughly a half-mile apart, all built in the last few days, based on the condition of the stones. They formed a line that curved along the ridgeline, then cut down into a hollow we hadn't searched yet, because it was off the main trail network and the terrain was brutal. thick laurel and steep descents. We followed the cairns down. The last one was at the edge of a small clearing, maybe 20 feet across, surrounded by dense rhododendron. In the center of the clearing was his jacket, folded neatly, placed on top of a flat rock. No other clothing, no signs of him, nothing else. Just the jacket. Here's the part that still keeps me up. The clearing was at the bottom of a hollow, a good 3 miles from where his pack had been found, and the route between the two involved some genuinely difficult terrain. Not impossible, but hard enough that you wouldn't attempt it without gear, especially not at night. And he would have had to build those cairns while making that trek in the dark, without his pack, without his headlamp, in freezing temperatures. The timeline didn't work. He'd been reported missing around 6 in the evening. We found his pack around midnight. The cairns and the jacket were already in place by the time we reached them late the next day, which meant he would have had to cover that ground, build all those markers, and get down into that hollow in less than 6 hours, in total darkness, without any of his gear. We tested the route ourselves during daylight with full equipment, and it took us nearly 4 hours just to get from the pack location to the clearing, moving carefully. We kept searching for another week, expanded the radius, brought in helicopters, checked every cave and crevice in that hollow. Never found him. Never found any other clothing, no remains, no signs of where he went after leaving that jacket. The case is still open, technically, listed as a missing person, but there's no activity on it. His girlfriend moved away about a year later. I heard she couldn't stand being in the area anymore, couldn't stop thinking about it. I've tried to rationalize it 100 different ways. Maybe he was having some kind of mental health crisis, did things that didn't make sense, wandered further than we thought possible. Maybe someone else built those cairns, and it was just a coincidence. Maybe the jacket was placed there by someone who found it and thought they were being helpful, though that doesn't explain why they wouldn't report it. None of those explanations feel right. The cairns were too deliberate, too evenly spaced. The jacket was too carefully placed. And the fact that we never found any trace of him after that, in terrain we covered exhaustively, doesn't sit well. I still see some of the people I worked that search with. We don't talk about it much. There's an understanding that it's better left alone. One of the dog handlers told me a few months afterward that his dog refused to work in that area anymore. He'd take the dog to the trailhead, and it would just sit down, wouldn't move, which wasn't like that dog at all. Eventually, he stopped bringing it to searches in that district. I think about those cairns sometimes, the precision of them, the effort it would have taken to build them in those conditions. I think about the jacket, folded and placed like someone was making a point, marking a spot. I think about the fact that we never found him, never found anything else, and how that hollow felt when we were down in it. Cold, yeah, but not just weather cold. The kind of cold that sits inside your chest and doesn't leave. The kind that makes you want to get out, get back up to the ridge, get somewhere with sight lines and open air. I don't coordinate searches anymore. I told myself it was time to step back, let younger people take those roles. But the truth is, I don't want to be the one making the call to send teams into terrain like that again. Terrain where things happen that don't have explanations. I don't want to be responsible for someone else walking into a situation they can't rationalize their way out of. The mountains have their own logic, and sometimes that logic doesn't align with ours. I've made my peace with not understanding it. I just don't need to be in the middle of it anymore. The second account comes from a ranger who worked the Central Appalachians, mostly in areas with extensive cave systems and old mining operations. I transferred out of that district the spring after we worked a search near one of the old coal mine sites. People assume it was for career advancement, and I let them think that. Easier than explaining what we found, or more accurately, what kept finding us while we were looking. I'd been a park ranger for about 12 years at that point. Worked all over the central Appalachian range, but that particular district was my favorite posting. Beautiful country, lots of history, decent trail network. Also a lot of old infrastructure for mining operations that shut down in the 60s and 70s. Sealed mine entrances, rusted equipment, foundations from buildings that had been torn down or left to rot. The Park Service had done a pretty good job of securing the dangerous sites, putting up fencing and warning signs, but you can't catch everything. There were hundreds of old mines in that area, scattered across ridges and hillsides, and not all of them were on official maps. The search started on a Saturday morning in March. A guy in his 30s had gone hiking the day before, told his wife he was going to explore some of the old mining areas, take photos, that sort of thing. He was into industrial history, liked documenting abandoned sites. When he didn't come home Friday night and didn't answer his phone, she called it in. We started organizing the search at first light. The area he'd been planning to explore was about 6 square miles of rugged terrain, a mix of forested ridges and cleared areas where the mining operations had left scars. Lots of old access roads, some still passable, others grown over. We set up a base at the main trailhead and sent out teams in a standard grid pattern. By mid-morning, one of the teams found his car parked on an old logging road about 3 miles in. The road wasn't gated, technically accessible, but it wasn't maintained, and most people didn't even know it was there. His camera was on the front seat. That was the first strange detail. If you are out taking photos, you don't leave your camera in the car. We checked the memory card. The last photos were taken around 4 in the afternoon the previous day. All shots of an old tipple structure about a half-mile up the road. After that, nothing. We concentrated the search around that area. The tipple was a rusted-out skeleton, mostly collapsed, sitting at the base of a hillside where the mine entrance had been. The entrance itself was sealed with a concrete plug and a steel gate. Both installed decades ago, both intact. No signs of tampering. We searched the immediate area, found a few footprints in the mud near the tipple that matched his boot size. The prints led away from the structure, heading uphill into the woods, then disappeared on rocky ground. Standard procedure at that point was to expand outward, check the surrounding forest, look for more tracks or signs of where he'd gone. That's when things started to feel off. We had 6 teams working different sectors, maintaining radio contact, checking in every 20 minutes. Around 1 in the afternoon, Team 3 radioed in to report they'd found boot prints again, about a quarter mile uphill from the tipple, heading deeper into the woods. Fresh prints, same size, same tread pattern, but the direction didn't make sense. The prints were heading north, up the ridge, away from the trail network and any logical destination. We repositioned teams to follow the track. Team 3 stayed on it, radioed updates as they moved. The prints kept going, steady pace, no signs of injury or distress, just someone walking with purpose through difficult terrain. Then Team 3 stopped responding. Their last check-in had been at 1:40 p.m., reporting they were still following the prints, about a mile north of the tipple. At 2:00 p.m., when they missed their check-in, I tried to raise them on the radio, nothing. Tried again at 2:05, 2:10, still nothing. I sent Team 5 to their last known location. It took them about 20 minutes to get there. They found Team 3 standing in a small clearing, all 4 of them, just standing there, not moving, not talking. When Team 5 called out to them, they didn't respond right away. Eventually, one of them turned around, looked at Team 5, and said they'd lost the trail. Said the prints had just stopped in the middle of the clearing. Team 5 brought them back to base. I debriefed them personally. They were shaken, all of them, but they couldn't articulate why. Said they'd been following the prints, came into the clearing, and the prints ended. No rocky ground, no reason for them to disappear, just ended mid-step. They said they'd been trying to figure out where the trail picked up again when they realized they couldn't hear anything. No birds, no wind, no sound from the other teams, even though they should have been within earshot. That's when they stopped moving, they said. Just stopped and waited. They didn't know why. They said it felt like the right thing to do at the time, but when I asked them to explain what that meant, they couldn't. I pulled Team 3 off the search, sent them back to town. They weren't in any condition to keep working. The rest of us kept going, but the whole operation felt different after that. Teams were reporting in more frequently than required, staying closer together. Nobody wanted to be out of sight of their partners. We found more boot prints that afternoon, scattered in different locations, never forming a continuous trail. A few prints here, heading west. A few prints there, heading south. Same boot, same tread, but the spacing and direction made no sense. It was like he'd teleported between spots, just appeared long enough to take a few steps, then vanished again. By evening, we still hadn't found him. We set up lights and kept searching through the night, brought in more volunteers from neighboring districts. Around 3 in the morning, one of the teams found something near an old ventilation shaft about 2 miles from where his car had been parked. The shaft was one of those vertical openings, maybe 4 feet across, with a rusted grate over the top. The grate had been there for decades, bolted into the rock, too heavy for one person to move, but it had been moved, pushed aside, not lifted, like something had slid it over. The bolts were still in place, bent outward. The team shined lights down into the shaft. It dropped about 30 feet, then opened into what looked like a horizontal tunnel. They could see water at the bottom, maybe a foot deep, and something else. His backpack, just sitting there in the water upright, like it had been placed. We called in a technical rescue team, got someone lowered down into the shaft. Took a few hours to coordinate, get the equipment in place, do it safely. The rescue tech went down, retrieved the backpack, checked the tunnel. The backpack was soaked but intact. His wallet, phone, keys, all there. The phone was dead, water damaged. The tunnel extended in both directions. Part of the old mine system, flooded and unstable. We couldn't send anyone further in without proper cave rescue equipment and structural assessments. So we backed out, called in specialists. Over the next 2 days, a cave rescue team mapped the accessible sections of that tunnel system. They found sections that connected to other sealed entrances, areas that had partially collapsed, rooms where old equipment was still sitting in the water. They didn't find him. Here's what kept bothering me. The grate over that shaft weighed at least 150 pounds. It would have taken multiple people to move it, or some kind of equipment. And even if he'd somehow moved it himself, why? Why climb down into a flooded mine shaft, leave your backpack, and then go deeper into a system with no light, no way out, no reason to be there? We checked the photos on his camera again, carefully. Went through every single frame. The last photo, the very last one, was of that ventilation shaft. The grate was in place in the photo. He'd taken a picture of it from above around 4 in the afternoon, which meant at some point after taking that photo, Something had happened that led to that grate being moved and his backpack ending up in the water below. We never found any other trace of him. The search went on for 2 more weeks, then scaled down to a recovery operation, then eventually was suspended. The case is still open. His wife moved out of state. I heard she couldn't stay in the area, couldn't stop thinking about those mines. The idea that he might still be down there, somewhere, in one of the flooded sections we couldn't access. I don't blame her. I think about it too, more than I'd like to admit. The thing that really got to me, though, was Team 3. I ran into one of those guys about a year later at a training event in another district. We talked for a bit, caught up. Eventually, he asked if I remembered that search. I said I did. He told me he'd never been able to shake the feeling from that clearing, the one where the boot prints stopped. Said he still dreams about it sometimes. In the dreams, he's standing in that clearing again, and he realizes the reason they couldn't hear anything was because they weren't supposed to. He said it felt like they'd walked into a space that wasn't meant for them, and the only reason they got out was because they had the sense to stay still and wait until they were allowed to leave. I didn't know what to say to that. Still don't. I transferred out that spring, told myself it was time to move on, try a different district, get some varied experience. But the truth is, I didn't want to work in an area where the mines were. Didn't want to be responsible for sending teams into terrain where old shafts and tunnels might be hidden under decades of growth, where the ground itself had been hollowed out and refilled and forgotten. Didn't want to coordinate another search where the evidence didn't form a narrative that made sense. The mountains are old, and the things humans cut into them are older than most of us realize. Sometimes those spaces hold on to things. Sometimes they don't give them back. I'm fine not being part of that equation anymore. The third account comes from a paramedic who worked with search and rescue teams in the northern Appalachians, responding to calls in remote areas. I stopped taking SAR calls in that part of the range the year I turned 38. Officially, I shifted to focusing on more urban response areas, which was a good career move and nobody questioned it. But the real reason was a search we worked in late October, and specifically, what the woman we found kept saying after we brought her down. I'd been working as a paramedic for about 14 years, spent a lot of that time doing SAR support in the northern Appalachians. When someone gets hurt or goes missing in the backcountry, we're the ones who go in with the search teams, ready to provide medical care as soon as they're located. I'd seen a lot. Broken bones, hypothermia, dehydration, a few cardiac events. You learn to expect the worst and hope for the best. What happened that October didn't fit into any category I knew. The call came in on a Thursday evening. A woman in her mid-50s had been reported missing by her hiking group. They'd been doing a multi-day trek, with camping on established sites, along a trail that followed a river valley. On the third day, she told the group she wanted to hike ahead to the next site, get there early and set up camp. They'd agreed, said they'd catch up with her in a few hours. When they reached the site that afternoon, she wasn't there. No sign she'd ever arrived. Her tent and most of her gear was still with the group, but she had her day pack with water and snacks. They searched the immediate area, called out for her, nothing. That's when they hiked back to the nearest road and called it in. We staged at a trailhead around 8 that night. 6 search teams, 12 volunteers, plus support staff, and I was paired with one of the ground teams as medical support. The trail was well maintained, followed the river for most of its length. Pretty straightforward navigation. The area where she was supposed to meet the group was about 7 miles in. We hiked through the night, searching the trail and the surrounding forest. The temperature was dropping, Forecast called for possible frost by morning, so we were moving fast. If she was injured and immobilized, every hour mattered. Around 4 in the morning, one of the teams found her. She was about a half-mile off trail, uphill from the river, sitting at the base of a large oak tree. She was conscious, alert, didn't appear injured. When the team called it in, I headed to their location with my gear. Got there maybe 10 minutes later. She was sitting exactly as they'd described, back against the tree, legs stretched out in front of her, hands in her lap. Her day pack was beside her, unopened. She was looking straight ahead, not at the team, not at anything in particular, just staring. I knelt down in front of her, started an assessment. Asked her name, if she knew where she was, if she was hurt. She turned her head slowly, looked at me, and said she was fine. Her vitals were good. No signs of hypothermia, no visible injuries, pupils responsive, speech clear. I asked her what happened, why she'd left the trail. She said she'd been following the markers. I asked what markers. She said the ones in the trees. I looked around. The forest was dense, mature hardwoods. Not much undergrowth. No trail markers in sight. No signs of any kind. I asked her to show me what she meant. She pointed up into the canopy. Said the markers were up there, small pieces of cloth tied to branches, white cloth. She said she'd seen them on the trail. Notes they led uphill. Thought maybe it was an alternate route to the campsite. So she followed them. I looked up, shined my flashlight into the branches. Didn't see anything. The other team members looked too. Nothing. No cloth, no markers, no signs that anyone had been up in those trees. I asked her how high up the markers were. She said 30, 40 feet, maybe higher. Said some of them were hard to see, but once you knew what you were looking for, they were obvious. We got her to her feet, started walking her back to the trail. She was cooperative, didn't resist, but she kept looking up into the trees, kept saying the markers were still there. She'd point them out as we walked. There and there. See that one? That one's barely visible, but it's there. I couldn't see anything. None of us could. I asked her if she'd hit her head, if she'd fallen at any point. She said no, said she'd just been walking, following the markers, and then she'd gotten tired and sat down to rest. She said she'd been sitting at that tree for a while, watching the markers move. That got my attention. I asked her what she meant by move. She stopped walking, looked at me like I was missing something obvious. Said the markers moved. Not all of them, just some of them. They'd shift from one tree to another, higher up or further along, showing the way. She said she'd been waiting to see where they went next when the search team found her. We got her back to the trail, started the hike out to the trailhead. She was quiet most of the way, occasionally, looking up into the trees but not saying much. When we reached the trailhead and got her into the ambulance, I did a more thorough assessment. Everything checked out. No signs of head trauma, no neurological deficits, blood sugar normal, no evidence of stroke or seizure. I asked her if she'd taken any medications recently, any history of hallucinations or mental health issues. She said no, seemed almost offended by the question. Said she knew what she saw, knew the markers were real. We transported her to the hospital. The ER doc ran more tests, kept her for observation. Everything came back normal. Physically, she was fine. Mentally, she insisted the markers had been real. She described them in detail. White cloth, torn strips, tied with simple knots, evenly spaced. She said she'd counted 27 of them before she stopped following, before she sat down at the tree. The ER doc noted it all, chalked it up to stress or exhaustion, or maybe some kind of dissociative episode brought on by the unfamiliar environment. But here's the thing that stayed with me. After we'd brought her out, after the search was officially over, I went back to that area on my day off. I wanted to see it in daylight, just to satisfy my own curiosity. I hiked the trail to the point where she would have left it, then headed uphill to where we'd found her. Took me about 20 minutes. The forest looked different in daylight, but I found the oak tree easily. Sat down in the same spot she'd been sitting, looked up into the canopy. I didn't see any white cloth, no markers, but I did see something else. There were scratches on some of the trees up high, marks in the bark that looked old, weathered. They were evenly spaced, and they followed a line uphill, deeper into the forest. I'm not saying they were made by someone tying cloth to the branches. I'm not saying there was any connection, but the spacing was regular, and they did form a path of sorts, if you were inclined to see it that way. I didn't follow them. I sat there for a while, trying to rationalize what she'd experienced. Maybe she'd seen the scratches and her brain had filled in the rest. Created the image of markers because that's what made sense to her in the moment. Maybe the stress of being separated from her group had caused some kind of perceptual distortion. Maybe it was all just coincidence, a tired hiker misinterpreting natural patterns in the forest. But I couldn't shake the image of her sitting at that tree, staring up into the branches, talking about markers that moved. The certainty in her voice when she described them. The way she'd pointed them out as we walked, like she was genuinely trying to help us see what she was seeing. And the fact that she'd followed them so far off trail, so far from where she'd intended to go, without apparently questioning it until she stopped to rest. I heard later that she never went hiking again. Her group finished their trek, but she went home early, didn't want to talk about what happened. I ran into one of the people from her hiking group about a year later, asked how she was doing. They said she was fine physically, but she'd become uncomfortable in forests, didn't like being under heavy canopy, didn't like camping, said it felt like something was always above her, just out of sight. I think about that sometimes when I'm working a call in wooded areas. Think about the scratches in the trees, the pattern they formed. Think about how easy it would be to see something in that pattern if you were in the right state of mind or the wrong one. The mountains are full of patterns. Water drains in predictable ways. Wind shapes trees. Animals create paths. Our brains are wired to find meaning in those patterns, to see intention where there might only be geology and time. But every once in a while, you encounter a pattern that feels different. A pattern that seems to be leading somewhere, suggesting something, inviting you to follow. I don't take SAR calls in that part of the range anymore. I told myself it made sense to focus on areas closer to the hospital, reduce response times, work with more urban teams. All of that is true, but I also don't want to be the one who finds someone sitting under a tree, staring up into branches, describing things I can't see. Don't want to be the one trying to explain to them that what they experienced wasn't real while knowing I can't prove that. The mountains keep their secrets, and sometimes those secrets leak out in ways that look like madness, but feel like something else entirely. The fourth account comes from a volunteer who'd been working searches in the Blue Ridge region for over a decade. I resigned from the search and rescue volunteer organization the summer after we worked a case involving a missing teenager. I gave them a clean reason, said I was moving out of the area for work, which was true enough. But the move was deliberate and the work was an excuse. I needed to be somewhere else. Somewhere that didn't have those particular ridges and hollows. Somewhere I wouldn't keep thinking about what we found in that cabin. I'd been volunteering with the SAR team for about 11 years, mostly in the Blue Ridge area. Good people, solid organization. We worked everything from lost day hikers to injured climbers to the occasional elderly person who'd wandered away from a group home. I'd seen a lot of difficult situations, but I'd also seen the good that comes from people working together, putting in the time and effort to bring someone home. That search in June changed how I thought about the work. The call came in on a Sunday morning. A 17-year-old girl had gone missing from a youth church group that was camping in a developed site near one of the state parks. She'd been there with about 20 other kids and several adult leaders. Saturday night, after dinner, she'd told one of the leaders she was going to her tent to read. When they did a head count before bed around 10, she wasn't in her tent. Her sleeping bag and most of her gear was there, but she was gone. They searched the immediate area, called out for her, nothing. Called the authorities around 11. We mobilized and were on site by 2 in the morning. The campground was typical for that area. Cleared sites, picnic tables, fire rings, pit toilets, a couple of water spigots. Surrounded by dense forest on all sides. The nearest road was a mile away. We started with a thorough search of the campground itself. Checked every tent, every vehicle, every building. Didn't find her. Moved to the surrounding forest. Sent teams out in all directions. The terrain was moderate, mostly forested ridges with some open areas. Several old logging roads cutting through. Decent visibility once you got away from the thickest growth. By sunrise, we'd covered about a 2-mile radius with no signs. Brought in a dog team, the dog picked up her scent trail, leading away from the campground, heading roughly northeast, away from the road and developed areas. We followed the trail for about 3 miles. The dog led us up a ridge, across a saddle, then down into a narrow hollow. At the bottom of the hollow was an old cabin. Small structure, maybe 12 by 12, looked like it had been there for decades. Logs were weathered gray. Roof was mostly intact but sagging in the middle. Single door, 1 window with no glass. The dog led us right to the door, then stopped. Sat down. Wouldn't go further. We called out. No response. I approached the door with 2 other volunteers. The door was ajar, hanging on rusted hinges. I pushed it open. Inside was dark. Took a moment for my eyes to adjust. There was a dirt floor, a few pieces of old furniture, a table with a broken leg, a chair. In the corner on the floor was a pile of blankets. Under the blankets was the girl. She was alive, conscious, curled up in a fetal position, facing the wall, not moving. I knelt down, identified myself, told her we were there to help. She didn't respond, didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge me. I checked for injuries, did a quick visual assessment. No obvious trauma, no blood, she was breathing normally. I asked her if she was hurt. No response. Asked her name. Nothing. One of the other volunteers tried talking to her. Same result. We called for the paramedic, got her checked out more thoroughly. Vitals were fine. Physically, she seemed okay. But she wouldn't speak. Wouldn't look at us. Wouldn't move unless we moved her. We got her onto a stretcher, carried her out of the hollow and back to the campground. The whole time, she stayed in that curled position, staring at nothing. The paramedic tried several more times to get her to respond, to tell us if she was in pain, if something had happened. Nothing. We transported her to the hospital. Her parents met us there. The moment she saw her mother, she started screaming. Not words, just screaming. The nurses had to sedate her. I stayed for a little while, talked to the parents, tried to explain what we'd found and where. They were devastated. couldn't understand what had happened or why she'd gone so far from the camp. Over the next few days, we pieced together some information. The girl eventually started speaking again, but she wouldn't talk about that night. Refused to discuss it with her parents, with the counselors the hospital brought in, with anyone. The only thing she said once to one of the nurses was that she'd heard someone calling her name from the woods and went to see who it was. After that, she wouldn't say anything else about it. The doctors ran every test they could think of. No drugs in her system, no signs of sexual assault, no physical injuries beyond some scratches from walking through the forest. Psychologically, she was traumatized, but they couldn't determine why. She was discharged after a week, went home with her parents, started intensive therapy. What bothered me, though, was the cabin. After we'd brought the girl out, a couple of us went back to document the site, take photos, see if there was any evidence of what had happened. The cabin was just as we'd left it, but in the daylight, we could see more details. The blankets she'd been under were old, filthy, looked like they'd been there for years. The rest of the cabin was empty except for the broken furniture. But on the walls, scratched into the wood, were marks. Hundreds of them. Small vertical lines grouped in sets of 5, like someone keeping count. They covered almost every surface, floor to ceiling. We counted them. Took a while. There were over 3,000 marks. We asked around, tried to find out who owned the land, if anyone knew the history of the cabin. The land was part of a national forest, had been for decades. The cabin was old enough that it probably predated the federal acquisition, built by someone who'd lived there before the area became public land. No records of who that might have been. The Park Service said they'd been aware of the structure, but hadn't prioritized removing it because it was so remote. They said they'd schedule it for demolition. Here's the part I can't rationalize. The girl's tent was about 3 miles from that cabin, through dense forest over a ridge, with no trail connecting them. She would have had to navigate that terrain in the dark with no flashlight, because her flashlight was still in her tent. The route the dog followed, the route her scent trail took, was direct, not wandering, not meandering like someone who was lost. Direct, like she knew where she was going, and the timing didn't work. She was last seen around 10 at night. We found her around 7 in the morning, but based on the condition of her clothes and shoes, she'd been in that cabin for longer than 9 hours. The dirt on her was ground in. The scratches on her arms and legs had started to scab. Her hair was matted like she'd been lying on that dirt floor for a long time. The doctors said maybe she'd lost track of time. That trauma can distort perception. But her watch was still working, still on her wrist. And the watch said it had been 4 days, not 9 hours. 4 days. The battery was fine. The watch was set correctly. It had been 4 days on her watch, but only 9 hours in the real world. The doctor said the watch must have malfunctioned, that she must have adjusted it without realizing. But I saw that watch. I saw the date on it. It wasn't wrong. It was just counting something else. I think about those marks on the walls. 3,000 vertical lines grouped in 5s. 15,000 individual scratches. If someone had been in that cabin keeping track of days, that would be over 40 years. And the marks looked old, weathered, except for the ones near the bottom, near the floor. Those looked fresh. 5 of them right near where the girl had been lying. 5 fresh marks, like someone had just added them that morning. We never figured out what happened. The case was closed as a found person. No evidence of a crime, no charges filed. The girl eventually recovered enough to go back to school, but I heard she was never quite the same.
Stopped going to church, stopped camping, didn't like being in wooded areas. Her parents moved to a different state a couple years later. I don't know if she's doing better now. I hope she is. I stopped volunteering that summer, told the organization I was relocating for work, which was true. I found a job in a different state, somewhere flat, somewhere without the old mountains and their forests and their forgotten cabins. I didn't tell anyone the real reason, which was that I couldn't stop thinking about those marks. Couldn't stop wondering who'd made them, and why there were fresh ones on the morning we found her. Couldn't stop thinking about her watch, and the 4 days it had counted that didn't exist for the rest of us. The mountains have always been here. They were here long before we arrived, and they'll be here long after we're gone. We build our trails and our campgrounds and our roads, and we tell ourselves we understand the landscape. We've mapped it. We've made it safe. But there
are still places that don't follow our rules. Places where time moves differently, where the distance between 2 points isn't fixed. I don't know what that cabin was, or why it was there, or what happened to the people who made those marks. I just know I don't want to find another one. I don't want to be the person who walks into a space like that and has to bring someone out, knowing they experienced something I'll never understand and can never explain. The work is important, and the people who do it are good people. But I've done my part, and I'm okay with that being enough. The 5th account comes from a ranger who worked searches in the Great Smoky Mountains area. I took a reassignment to a district without backcountry responsibilities. The winter I turned 36. People assumed it was a lifestyle choice, that I wanted more regular hours, less physical strain. I let them assume that. The real reason was the search we worked in October, and specifically, the things we heard in the recordings that Hiker's phone had captured. I'd been a ranger for 9 years at that point, most of it in the Smokies, working trails, managing campsites, coordinating search and rescue operations when needed. It's demanding work, but I loved it. The landscape, the wildlife, the sense that you're helping people experience something meaningful. That search changed how I felt about the job, about the mountains themselves. The call came in on a Wednesday afternoon. A solo hiker, a guy in his mid-40s, had missed his check-in call with his wife. He'd been doing a 3-day loop, planned route, established campsites. He was experienced, had done the loop before, always checked in with his wife every evening via satellite phone. Tuesday night, he'd called on schedule, said everything was fine. He'd made good time, weather was clear. Wednesday night, no call. She waited until Thursday morning, then contacted us. We mobilized a search team, accessed his planned route from the permit he'd filed. He should have been on the second night of his loop, camped at a site about 12 miles in. We reached the site around noon. His tent was set up, gear neatly organized, food hung properly in a bear bag. Everything looked normal except he wasn't there. We called out, searched the immediate area, found his boots outside the tent, which was strange. If you're going to leave your campsite, you wear your boots. We expanded the search, checked the surrounding forest, the nearby stream, the trail in both directions. No sign of him. His satellite phone was inside the tent, turned off. His regular phone was there too, also off. We bagged both as evidence, continued searching. That night, we set up a base at the campsite, kept teams working in shifts. By Friday morning, we still hadn't found him. We'd covered a 3-mile radius, checked every trail junction, every creek crossing, every ridge and hollow. Brought in helicopters, infrared cameras, more volunteers, nothing. On Friday afternoon, one of the techs working on his phones managed to get them powered up. The satellite phone showed only the one call to his wife Tuesday night, nothing after. but his regular phone had something strange. The voice recorder app had been activated Wednesday evening around 7 and had recorded for about 45 minutes before the battery died. We listened to the recording. The first few minutes were quiet, just ambient forest sounds. Wind, birds, distant water. Then his voice. He was talking to himself, narrating what he was doing. Said he'd heard something moving around his campsite, thought it might be a bear, was going to investigate. We could hear him walking, branches breaking, his breathing. Then he stopped. Said he could see something through the trees, maybe 50 yards away. Described it as a figure, tall, standing very still. Said he thought it was another hiker at first, but the posture was wrong, too rigid. He called out, asked if they needed help. No response. He said he was going to get closer, make sure they were okay. The recording continued. We could hear him walking, his footsteps on leaves, his breathing getting heavier. Then he stopped again. This is where the recording got difficult to listen to. He said the figure was gone. He'd gotten to where it had been standing, but there was nothing there. No person, no tracks, nothing. He sounded confused. Said he was sure he'd seen someone, but now he couldn't find any sign of them. He said he was going to head back to his tent. But then the recording changed. His footsteps continued, but they didn't sound like they were going back to the campsite. They sounded like they were going deeper into the woods, uphill, away from the trail. And he wasn't talking anymore, just breathing, footsteps, breathing, footsteps. This went on for about 20 minutes. Then the footsteps stopped. We could hear wind, branches creaking, and then, very faintly, voices. Not his voice. Multiple voices, overlapping, too quiet to make out words, but definitely human voices. He didn't respond to them, didn't call out, didn't ask who was there. The voices continued for about 5 minutes, then faded. After that, the recording was just wind and forest sounds for another 10 minutes until the phone battery died. We analyzed the audio, tried to filter it, enhance it, figure out what the voices were saying. The tech said the voices were strange. They had odd pitch variations, phrasing that didn't sound natural. He said it almost sounded like recordings being played back at variable speeds, but he couldn't isolate any specific words. We cross-referenced the timestamps on the recording with the GPS data from his satellite phone. Based on the signal history, he'd been at his campsite when the recording started. The satellite phone had last pinged a tower around 7:30 Wednesday evening, and the location matched the campsite. After that, no signal, which suggested he'd either moved into an area with no coverage, or the phone had been turned off or destroyed. We went back to the site on Friday afternoon, retraced what we thought was his route based on the audio. There was a slope heading uphill from the campsite, through dense forest, that matched the sound of his footsteps in the recording. We followed it for about a mile, came to a ridgeline. On the other side was a steep drop into a gorge, heavily forested, difficult terrain. We spent the rest of Friday and all of Saturday searching that gorge. Never found him. Never found any gear, any clothing, any sign he'd been there. The search went on for another week, then scaled down to a recovery operation, then eventually was suspended. He's still listed as missing, but here's what stayed with me. After we'd finished the active search, I went back and listened to that recording again, by myself with good headphones. I wanted to see if I could make out anything in those voices, any detail that might tell us what happened. And I heard something the tech either missed or didn't mention. Right at the end, in the last few seconds before the battery died, there was a sound. Faint, almost imperceptible. It sounded like footsteps. Multiple sets, moving in unison, surrounding the phone. And then, just before it cut out, a whisper. One word clear enough to understand. Follow. I played it back a dozen times to make sure. It was there, no question. Someone or something had whispered that word right before the phone died. I documented it, added it to the case file. Nobody said much about it. The official position was that it was probably wind-distorting sound or an artifact of the recording process, or maybe even the hiker himself, whispering without realizing it. But I know what I heard, and I know that if he followed whatever those voices were, if he walked into that gorge in the dark, listening to something that told him to follow, we're never going to find him. I think about that recording sometimes. The way his footsteps sounded so deliberate, so purposeful, even though he wasn't talking, wasn't narrating anymore. Like he'd stopped questioning what he was doing and just accepted it. And those voices, overlapping, too quiet to understand but loud enough to hear. I think about the word at the end. Follow, not a question, not a suggestion, a command. And the sound of multiple footsteps surrounding the phone, moving together. The Smokies are old mountains, worn down over millions of years. They're covered in forests that have been growing and dying and regrowing for longer than humans have been here. There are places in those mountains where the tree canopy is so thick that daylight barely reaches the ground, where fog settles in the valleys and doesn't lift for days, where the sound of water and wind can create echoes that make you think you're hearing voices. I'd always understood that intellectually, but after that search, after that recording, I started to feel it differently. Started to feel like those echoes weren't just physics. Started to feel like maybe some of them were saying something, inviting something, leading somewhere. I requested the reassignment that winter. Took a position in a district that focuses on developed areas, visitor centers, maintain trails. I still work for the Park Service, still help people, still do good work, but I don't go into the backcountry anymore. Don't coordinate searches in those remote areas where the forest is thick and the trails are narrow and the distances between campsites are measured in hours of hard hiking. I don't want to listen to another recording like that. Don't want to hear those voices, that command, that certainty, that someone followed something into the dark and didn't come back. The mountains can keep their secrets. I'm fine not knowing them anymore. The sixth account comes from a search and rescue volunteer who worked in the southern Appalachians, near the Tennessee-North Carolina border. I stopped volunteering this spring after we worked a search that involved a family of 4. I told people I needed to focus on my career, which was partially true. But the main reason was what the kids drew in the weeks after we brought them out, and what their drawing suggested about what they'd seen during those 3 days. I'd been volunteering with a SAR team for about 7 years, working mostly in the mountains along the Tennessee-North Carolina border. Rugged country, lots of state parks and national forest land, popular with tourists, but also easy to get lost in if you wander off the established trails. I'd worked dozens of searches, most of them ending well, a few ending badly, all of them teaching me something about the landscape and human behavior in crisis situations. The call came in on a Friday evening in March. A family had gone camping, 2 parents and 2 kids, ages 6 and 8. They'd been planning to camp at a developed site, but apparently decided to try some dispersed camping instead. Drove up an old Forest Service road, found a clearing, set up their tents. That was Thursday afternoon. Friday morning, the father was supposed to check in with his brother via cell phone. When he didn't call and didn't answer when his brother tried calling back, the brother drove out to the area where they'd said they were camping, found their vehicle on the Forest Service road, but no sign of the family. Called the authorities around 2 in the afternoon. We staged at the vehicle around 4. 2 tents, a cooler, camping gear, all of it still at the site, but no people. The fire ring had cold ashes, looked like it hadn't been used since Thursday night. We spread out, searched the immediate area, found tracks leading away from the site into the woods. The tracks were from multiple people, adults and children, heading roughly west into thicker forest. We followed them for about a half mile, then lost them on rocky ground. Expanded the search, brought in more teams, worked through the night. Saturday morning, one of the teams found the mother. She was about 2 miles from the campsite, sitting on a log near a creek, soaking wet, shivering, unresponsive. We got her warmed up, checked her vitals, tried to get her to tell us what happened. She couldn't speak coherently, just kept saying they had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of it. Wouldn't elaborate, kept looking over her shoulder, flinching at sounds. We got her to the hospital, kept searching for the rest of the family. We found the father and the 2 kids Saturday afternoon. They were together, huddled in a small cave, maybe 4 miles from the original campsite. The father was semi-conscious, hypothermic but stable. The kids were cold and scared, but physically okay. We got them all to the hospital, reunited them with the mother. Over the next few days, we tried to piece together what had happened. The father, once he'd recovered enough to talk, said they'd heard something Thursday night. Something moving around their tents, circling the campsite. He'd assumed it was an animal, maybe a bear or a coyote, and he'd made noise to scare it off. But it didn't leave, it kept circling. He said it got close enough that he could hear it breathing. Heavy, wet breaths, right outside the tent fabric. He'd grabbed a flashlight, unzipped the tent, shined the light out. Didn't see anything, but the breathing continued. He said he'd decided they needed to leave, that something wasn't right. So they'd packed up quickly, left most of their gear, and started walking. He said they walked through the night, trying to put distance between themselves and whatever had been at the campsite. The mother's story was similar, but more fragmented. She said they'd kept walking Friday, trying to find their way back to a road or a trail, but everything looked the same. She said they could hear it following them. Not close, but not far either. She said it stayed just out of sight, behind trees, behind ridges, but they could hear it moving, hear it breathing. She said at some point Friday evening, they'd reached a creek and decided to follow it, thinking it might lead to a road or a house. But she'd slipped on rocks, fallen in the water, gotten separated from the rest of the family. She said she'd called out for them, but couldn't hear any responses. Said she'd tried to find them, but got turned around in the dark. Eventually just sat down and waited for daylight. The kids' stories were the most disturbing. The 6-year-old wouldn't talk at all, just clung to his mother and cried whenever anyone asked him questions. The 8-year-old, a girl, talked a little bit. She said they'd seen it Friday morning, said it had been standing at the edge of the trees watching them. She said it was tall, taller than her dad, and it didn't move right. Said it looked like a person, but the arms were too long and the head was wrong. She said they'd run after seeing it, and it had followed them all day. Said it never got close, but it was always there, always behind them. The hospital brought in counselors, psychiatrists, specialists in childhood trauma. The consensus was that the family had gotten lost, panicked, experienced some kind of shared stress-induced hallucination or misidentification of wildlife. The mother had fallen in the creek, gotten separated, developed mild hypothermia, which contributed to her disorientation. The father had been focused on keeping the kids safe and calm, which explained his version being more measured. The kids had been terrified, and their young minds had created an explanation that made sense to them. a monster chasing them. Standard psychological response to a frightening situation. But then the girl started drawing. The hospital gave the kids paper and crayons, a way to process what they'd experienced. The girl drew pictures of the things she said she'd seen. She drew it over and over, dozens of pictures. They all showed the same basic figure. Tall, thin, arms that reached past its knees, and a head that was elongated, stretched upward. She drew it standing behind trees, standing in clearings, standing at the edge of the paper, looking in. The drawings were consistent. Same proportions every time, same posture, same wrong head shape. One of the counselors showed the drawings to the father, asked if this was what he'd seen Thursday night when he'd shined the flashlight out of the tent. He'd gone pale, said no, he hadn't seen anything. But later, when the counselor wasn't in the room, he'd pulled one of the nurses aside and said that when he'd opened the tent and shined the light, he had seen something just for a second. He said it had been standing maybe 20 feet away, at the edge of the firelight's reach. He said it had been tall and thin and wrong, and when the light hit it, it had moved sideways behind a tree, faster than anything that size should be able to move. He said he'd convinced himself it had been a trick of shadows and light, that he'd been seeing things. But looking at his daughter's drawings, he wasn't sure anymore. The family was discharged after a week. They went home, started therapy, tried to move on. I heard later that they sold their camping gear, didn't go back to the mountains. The father took a job in a different state, somewhere flat. The mother started having nightmares, had to be medicated for a while. The kids were in intensive counseling for months. What bothered me most was the consistency. The girl's drawings never changed. Same figure every time, same impossible proportions. And the father's description, when he finally admitted what he'd seen, matched those drawings. Tall, thin, arms too long, head wrong. I tried to rationalize it. Folie à deux, shared delusion brought on by stress. Misidentified wildlife. Maybe a bear standing on its hind legs, seen from an angle that distorted its shape. Shadows and fear creating a shared narrative the family could process. But I went back to that campsite a few weeks later, wanted to see it in daylight, see if there was anything we'd missed during the search. The site was still there, disturbed but recognizable. Their fire ring, some trash they'd left behind in their rush to leave. I walked the route they would have taken, followed the general direction the tracks had indicated. About a quarter mile from the campsite, I found something. A tree, a large oak with marks on it. Deep scratches in the bark, running vertically, starting about 7 feet off the ground and going up another 3 feet. 4 parallel gouges, evenly spaced. Too high for a bear, too deep and clean for deer antlers. I touched them, fresh, no weathering, made within the last few weeks. And they were on multiple trees, forming a line that led away from the campsite in the direction the family had gone. I didn't follow the line. I went back to the campsite, got in my vehicle, drove back to town. I documented what I'd found, added it to the case file. Nobody said much about it. The official conclusion remained that the family had panicked and gotten lost, experienced stress-related hallucinations. The scratches on the trees were attributed to bears or other wildlife. Though no one could explain the height or the pattern, I stopped volunteering that spring. Told the organization I appreciated the experience, but needed to focus on other priorities. They understood, thanked me for my service. I didn't tell anyone the real reason, which was that I couldn't stop thinking about those drawings, those scratches, the way the father's face had looked when he saw what his daughter had been drawing. Couldn't stop thinking about the fact that something had been circling their campsite Thursday night. Something with arms long enough to make scratches 10 feet off the ground. Something that had followed them for miles through the forest without ever showing itself fully. The mountains are full of wildlife. Bears, deer, coyotes, bobcats, dozens of species that have lived there longer than humans have. Most of them avoid people. Most of them want nothing to do with us. But every once in a while, someone encounters something that doesn't fit the known wildlife profiles. Something that behaves in ways that don't match any catalog species. I don't know what that family encountered. I don't know if it was a known animal behaving strangely or something else, something we don't have a name for. What I know is that their experience was consistent. Their fear was real, and the evidence suggested something had been there with them, something that left marks and moved in ways that shouldn't be possible. I don't need to understand it. I just need to not be part of finding someone else who's encountered it. The work is important, but there are limits to what I'm willing to expose myself to. I've reached mine. The 7th account comes from a ranger who worked in a district known for its extensive cave systems. I transferred to a coastal park the fall after we worked a search near the limestone caves. On paper, it was a promotion, better pay, more responsibility. In reality, I needed to be somewhere without caves, somewhere the ground was solid all the way down, somewhere I wouldn't have to think about the spaces underneath. I'd been a ranger for 13 years, spent most of that time in a district with some of the most extensive cave systems in the Appalachians. Beautiful geology, popular with spelunkers, carefully managed by the Park Service to balance public access with conservation. I'd done cave tours, educational programs, rescue training. I knew those systems well, knew the hazards, knew the protocols. I thought I understood what we were dealing with. The search that September showed me I didn't. The call came in on a Sunday morning. A caver hadn't returned from a solo exploration trip. He'd filed a permit, listed his planned route through a moderately difficult cave system, said he'd be back by Saturday evening. When he didn't show up and didn't answer his phone, his girlfriend called it in. We mobilized a cave rescue team, accessed the cave entrance around noon Sunday. The entrance was a vertical drop, about 40 feet, into a large chamber. From there, the system branched out in multiple directions. Some passages mapped and well-traveled, others less explored. We descended into the entrance chamber, found his gear. Rope, harness, helmet, lights, all of it staged at the top of the first drop. That was wrong. If you're going into a cave system, you take your gear with you. You don't leave it at the entrance. We checked his permit, confirmed his planned route. He was supposed to explore a passage that led to a series of smaller chambers, moderate difficulty, well mapped. We sent teams in that direction, following the established route. 3 hours in, we found his helmet. It was sitting on a rock in the middle of a passage, light still on, battery at about 50%. No sign of him. We expanded the search, checked adjacent passages, looked for any signs of where he might have gone, found nothing. Then one of the teams noticed something. The passage where we'd found the helmet didn't match the map. The dimensions were right, the general direction was right, but there was an opening in the wall that wasn't on any of the maps. A narrow crack, maybe 2 feet wide, leading into darkness. We approached carefully, checked the opening. It looked natural, limestone erosion, but it didn't appear on any documentation we had. We called back to base, asked them to pull up the most recent survey data. They confirmed no opening in that location on any official maps. We shined lights into the crack. It went back about 10 feet, then opened into what looked like a larger space. We could hear water dripping, echoes suggesting a chamber of some size. I made the call to send a team in. 2 experienced cavers, full safety equipment, radio contact, strict time limits. They entered the crack, radioed back that it opened into a chamber about 20 feet across. Natural formation, unremarkable except for the fact that it wasn't mapped. They found another passage leading out of the chamber, heading downward. They followed it for about 50 feet, then stopped. Said the passage opened into something much larger. Too large to see the far walls with their lights. Said they could hear water, distant sounds, echoes that suggested a significant cave system. They asked for permission to continue. I said no, told them to mark the location and come back. We needed to regroup, assess the situation properly. They marked the passage entrance with reflective tape, headed back. When they reached the chamber, they found something, a shoe. His shoe, positively identified by the brand and size. It was sitting in the middle of the chamber floor, placed upright, not dropped or lost. Placed. They bagged it, brought it out. We sent another team in, expanded the search into the new passage. They descended carefully, following the downward slope, checking for any signs of him. The passage went down for about 100 feet, then leveled out into an enormous chamber. They estimated it was at least 100 feet across, ceiling lost in darkness above them. The floor was uneven, covered in formations, columns and flowstone and breakdown, and scattered across the floor were items: his other shoe, his watch, his phone, his wallet, all placed deliberately, spaced out across the chamber like markers. We brought in more teams, established a forward base in the large chamber, spent the rest of Sunday and all of Monday searching. The chamber had multiple exits, passages leading in different directions, most of them unmapped. We systematically explored each one, documented everything, looked for any trace of where he'd gone. In one of the passages, we found clothing. His shirt, his pants, neatly folded and placed on a ledge. In another passage, we found his backpack, empty, hanging from a formation. The pattern was clear, but made no sense. He'd been leaving items behind, moving deeper into the system, shedding equipment and clothing as he went. Tuesday afternoon, we found him. He was in a passage that sloped downward at about 45 degrees, ending in a pool of water. He was at the edge of the pool, partially submerged face down. We recovered him, brought him back to the entrance, confirmed what we already knew. He'd been dead for at least 2 days, likely died sometime Saturday. Cause of death appeared to be drowning, though the autopsy would confirm. But here's what didn't make sense. The pool where we found him was almost 2 miles from the entrance, through a series of passages and chambers that weren't on any maps. The route he would have had to take to get there involved climbs, descents, squeezes through narrow sections, all without gear, without lights, without any of the equipment that was scattered through the chambers behind him. And the pool itself was at the end of a passage with no other exits. He'd gone there deliberately, walked to the edge, entered the water and drowned. The autopsy didn't provide many answers. No drugs in his system, no signs of head trauma or any injury that would explain why he'd left his gear and gone so deep into an unmapped system. The coroner noted some unusual abrasions on his hands and knees, consistent with crawling over rough limestone, but nothing that suggested a struggle or forced movement. The official conclusion was accidental death, likely related to disorientation and poor decision-making in a complex cave environment. But that didn't explain the items. The way they'd been placed, spaced out, deliberately left behind. It didn't explain why he'd gone so deep into unmapped passages, or how he'd navigated without light. We tested the route, tried to see if it was possible to make that journey in the dark. It wasn't. Not safely, not without falling or getting stuck or lost in one of the dozens of side passages. Yet he'd made it all the way to that pool 2 miles in, through terrain that would have been difficult, even with full equipment and lighting. One of the cavers on the recovery team, a guy with 30 years of experience, told me something after we'd brought the body out. He said he'd been in a lot of caves, seen a lot of strange formations and unusual geology, but he'd never been in a system that felt like that one. Said the air was wrong, the sounds were wrong. Said the echoes didn't behave the way they should, that voices seemed to carry further than made sense, and sometimes seemed to come from directions that didn't match where people were standing. He said when they were in the large chamber, the one where we'd found his scattered belongings, he'd heard something. Faint, distant, almost imperceptible. Singing. He said it sounded like someone singing. A melody he didn't recognize, coming from one of the unmapped passages. He'd asked the other team members if they heard it. None of them had. He'd convinced himself it was his imagination, the stress of the search creating phantom sounds. But he said it had been clear enough that he'd turned his head toward it, tried to locate the source. Said it had been coming from the passage that led down to the pool where we eventually found the body. I didn't know what to say to that. I'd heard strange sounds in caves before. Water creates acoustics that can sound like voices or music. Wind through narrow passages can whistle and moan. Rock falls and settling can create rhythmic sounds. I'd never heard singing, but I understood how someone could interpret ambiguous sounds as something familiar. I thanked him for sharing, added his observations to the case file. Nobody commented on it. The investigation was closed, the death ruled accidental, the family was notified, but I requested the transfer. Told my supervisors I wanted to try a different kind of park, get some coastal experience, broaden my skill set. They approved it. I moved that fall, started working in a park where the ground is sand and clay, and the only caves are small erosional features in bluffs. I still do search and rescue work, still coordinate operations when needed, but I don't go underground anymore. Don't want to be in spaces where the light doesn't reach, where the sounds don't behave predictably, where passages exist that aren't on any maps. The mountains are full of caves, thousands of them, carved out over millions of years by water and time. Most of them are known, mapped, studied. Some of them are protected, some are open to the public, some are too dangerous to enter, and some of them connect to spaces that shouldn't exist, passages that lead deeper than any map suggests, chambers that echo with sounds that have no source. I don't know what that caver heard or followed into that unmapped system. I don't know why he left his gear behind, shed his clothing, walked 2 miles through darkness to a pool at the end of a passage with no exit. I just know that the evidence suggests he went there deliberately, following something, responding to something, and it led him to a place where he couldn't come back from. The caves remember. They hold on to what happened in them, what moved through them, what was left behind. I've made my peace with not going back into them, not exploring those spaces anymore. The work above ground is enough. The mountains can keep what's underneath. The 8th and final account comes from a coordinator who worked searches across multiple districts in the Appalachians. I stopped taking coordination assignments the winter I turned 42. I'd been working search and rescue operations for almost 18 years at that point, coordinating teams across multiple districts, managing complex searches involving dozens of volunteers in multiple agencies. I'd seen everything. Successful rescues, tragic recoveries, cold cases that would never be solved. I thought I'd develop the thick skin you need for that kind of work, the ability to compartmentalize and move on. But the search we worked in December broke something in me, and I realized I couldn't keep doing it. Not after what we found, and more specifically, what found us. The call came in on a Thursday evening right before Christmas. A couple in their 60s had gone hiking on a popular trail, a moderate loop that thousands of people do every year. They were experienced hikers, properly equipped, had done the trail multiple times. They'd signed the trail register at the head around 10 in the morning, saying they planned to complete the loop by mid-afternoon. When they hadn't returned by sunset and weren't answering their phones, their daughter called it in. We mobilized around 7 that evening, staged at the trailhead, sent teams out along the loop in both directions. The trail was well maintained, clearly marked, about 9 miles total. Weather was cold but clear, no precipitation, good visibility once we got our lights set up. We should have found them quickly, but the first teams that completed the loop reported no signs of them. No one on the trail, no indication they'd left it. We expanded the search, checked side trails, old connector paths, areas where people sometimes wander off. Still nothing. By midnight, we'd covered the entire trail network in that area with no results. Brought in dogs. The dogs picked up their scent at the trailhead, followed it along the trail for about 2 miles, then lost it. Not at a creek, not at a confusing junction. Just lost it in the middle of a straight section of trail. That's when we started checking the register more carefully. They'd signed in at 10, but so had 4 other groups that day, all of whom had completed their hikes and signed out. None of them reported seeing the couple. I contacted each group personally, asked detailed questions. All of them confirmed they'd been on that trail that day, during the time frame when the couple would have been there too. None of them had seen or passed anyone matching the description. On a 9-mile loop trail with 6 groups hiking it on the same day, nobody had seen them. We kept searching through the night and into Friday, covered every inch of terrain within a 2-mile radius of the trail. Brought in helicopters with thermal imaging, nothing. Friday afternoon, one of the teams found their car still in the parking lot, which we'd already known, but they also found something else. 2 sets of footprints in a muddy section at the trailhead, leading away from the parking lot. Fresh prints, right size, right pattern for hiking boots, but they led in the opposite direction from the trail. They led into the woods on the other side of the parking lot, into an area with no trails, no destination, nothing but dense forest, climbing up a steep ridge. We followed the prints. They went uphill for about a 1/4 mile, steady pace, side by side, 2 people walking together. Then they reached a rocky section and disappeared. We spread out, searched the surrounding area, found the prints again another 100 yards uphill, then lost them again. This pattern continued. We'd find them, follow them for a bit, lose them on rocks or hard ground, find them again further along. Always heading uphill, always parallel, always steady. No signs of distress, no indication they were lost or injured, just walking with purpose. Around sunset Friday, we reached the top of the ridge. The footprints led to a flat area, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by trees. In the center of the area was a circle, not a natural formation. A perfect circle, about 10 feet in diameter, made of small stones, placed edge to edge. Inside the circle was nothing. Just bare ground, no vegetation, no leaves, nothing. And sitting at the exact center of the circle were 2 items. Their phones. Side by side, both turned off. We documented the scene, bagged the phones, kept searching. The footprints continued on the other side of the circle, heading down the far side of the ridge. We followed them into thick forest, through laurel thickets, down a steep slope. Lost daylight, continued with artificial lights. The prints led us down for over a mile, through terrain that was getting increasingly difficult. Then they stopped at a creek. Not at a crossing point, not at a wide, shallow section. At a deep pool, water at least 6 feet deep, steep banks on both sides. The prints approached the edge of the pool and ended. No prints on the far side. No signs they'd tried to cross upstream or downstream. Just ended at the water's edge. We searched the creek. Brought in divers Saturday morning. Had them check the pool and the sections upstream and downstream. They didn't find bodies, didn't find any clothing or gear. The water was clear, visibility was good. If they'd drowned in that pool, we would have found them. But there was nothing. The divers did report one thing. At the bottom of the pool, about 8 feet down, there was an opening. Not a natural formation, they said. Too regular, too precise. It looked like a tunnel heading down and back under the ridge. They said it was maybe 3 feet wide, perfectly round, disappearing into darkness. They didn't enter it. I didn't ask them to. We kept searching through the weekend, expanded the area, brought in more resources. On Sunday afternoon, one of the teams found something about 2 miles downstream from the pool. A jacket. His jacket positively identified. It was draped over a branch that hung out over the creek, about 6 feet above the water. Dry, undamaged, deliberately placed. Inside the jacket pocket was a note. Handwritten, his handwriting according to the family. It said, "We're continuing down. Don't follow. Tell everyone we're sorry." That was it. No explanation, no details, no indication of why they'd left the trail, why they'd climbed that ridge, why their footprints had led to that pool, or why his jacket was 2 miles downstream from where the prints ended. The note didn't make sense in any rational framework. Continuing down where? Down into what? And don't follow. Follow what? The search continued for another week, but the intensity scaled down. The note suggested they'd left voluntarily, that whatever they were doing was intentional. The authorities treated it as a missing persons case rather than a rescue. We never found them. Never found any other clothing, any more notes, any trace of where they'd gone after that jacket was placed. The case is still open, but there's no active investigation. I tried to rationalize it. Elderly couple, maybe experiencing some kind of shared delusion, made poor decisions, ended up drowning in a section of creek we didn't search thoroughly enough. Bodies washed downstream or got caught in underwater debris. The note was a result of confused thinking, written during a mental health crisis. The circle of stones was unrelated, just something they'd happened to encounter maybe, built by kids or previous hikers. The tunnel at the bottom of the pool was a natural formation, maybe connected to an old mine or cave system, but none of that felt right. The footprints were too deliberate. The circle was too perfect. The placement of the phones, the jacket, the note, all of it suggested intention, purpose, a plan being followed. And the note itself, we're continuing down. Not we're continuing on or we're continuing our hike. Down, specifically down. I thought about that tunnel at the bottom of the pool. Thought about the way the divers had described it. Too regular, too precise. Thought about what might be down there, under the ridge, under the creek, under the mountains. Thought about spaces that aren't on any maps, passages that lead to places we don't have names for. 3 months after that search, I was contacted by a hiker who'd been on that same trail the day the couple went missing. He'd seen my name in a news article about the search and wanted to share something. He said he'd been one of the groups that had signed the register that morning, one of the groups that had completed the loop without seeing the couple. But he said he remembered something strange. Around noon, when he'd been at the furthest point of the loop, he'd heard singing. He said it had been faint, distant, coming from somewhere uphill off the trail. He said it had sounded like two voices, harmonizing, a melody he didn't recognize. He'd mentioned it to his hiking partner at the time, but they'd both dismissed it as maybe another group camping somewhere in the backcountry. He said after he'd read about the search, about the couple going missing that same day, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop wondering if what he'd heard had been them, singing as they walked up that ridge, heading toward that circle, toward that pool, toward whatever they'd found at the bottom. I thanked him for the information, added it to my notes. I didn't tell him that two other people, from two other groups that had been on the trail that day, had also contacted me in the months after the search. Both of them had reported hearing something similar, distant singing, two voices, coming from off the trail. All three reports described it the same way. Harmonizing, melodic, moving away from the trail and uphill. I stopped coordinating searches after that. Told the organizations I'd worked with that I appreciated the experience but needed to step back, focus on other aspects of my life. They understood, thanked me for my years of service. I didn't tell them the real reason, which was that I couldn't shake the image of that couple walking up that ridge, side by side, steady and purposeful, leaving their phones in a perfect circle of stones and continuing down into something that led them to a pool with a tunnel at the bottom. Couldn't shake the image of them singing as they went, their voices carrying through the forest, heard by strangers on a trail below who dismissed it as nothing important. The mountains are full of paths. Some of them are marked on maps, maintained by park services, walked by thousands of people every year. Some of them are old game trails, unmarked but visible if you know what to look for. And some of them aren't paths at all, not in any physical sense. They're invitations, suggestions, routes that only exist for certain people at certain times, leading to places that don't appear on any survey. I don't know where those paths go. I don't know what waits at the end of them, or what happens to the people who follow them. I just know that every year, a few people accept the invitation. They walk away from the established trails, away from safety and light and other people. They climb ridges and descend into hollows and find circles and pools and tunnels. And they continue down. I'm done being part of the effort to bring them back. The work is important, and the people who still do it are brave and dedicated. But there are limits to what we can retrieve from the mountains, limits to what we can understand or prevent. Some people go into those spaces and don't come back because they can't. And some people don't come back because they chose not to. I've made my peace with not knowing the difference, with accepting that the mountains take what they take and the reasons are beyond me. The trails I walk now are paved and well lit and lead to parking lots where my car is always waiting. That's enough. That's all I need. The rest can stay in the mountains, in the hollows, in the spaces under the ridges where the water runs deep and cold, and the tunnels lead down to places we were never meant to find.